Is that better? Oh, okay. Okay, now it works. Okay. Okay. Um, yeah, so we have one more session. So thinking about among the different topics that I thought about, which ones are worth presenting. I think they're saying they can hear now. Yeah. Um, yeah, I switched the speakers, so now it seems. Yeah, no, it was on here, and then I changed it to this, and now it's working. Um, so yeah, one person had mentioned about questions of social responsibility. So there's a few points here that do relate to that, and I'll try to fit that in. I'd mentioned about linguistics several times, so I think I might start with that. And then I mentioned about psychology, although I might skip over that. Although it's interesting, I don't have maybe as much to say directly about that. Of course, psychology is very central to the Buddhist tradition, but in terms of just what I can think of to say in terms of comparing it with Western psychology or modern psychology. Although I could say a bit, I don't have, unless somebody feels particularly that they would really like to hear about that. I'll leave that. You would like to hear? Okay. Okay.
Maybe reincarnation.
Yeah, or reincarnation. Okay, I'll try to fit everything in. Just bear with me, and as we said in the morning, just try to keep the questions maybe till the end so that we can get through more things. So with psychology, then, it's something that's also interested me quite a bit. It's something I'd considered for my own study when I was young. Probably, I don't know if it was the first thing, but the first thing I can remember wanting to be was a firefighter. This is what, young American kids, when I was maybe 4 or 5 years old, I told my parents I wanted to be a firefighter. I don't know, maybe it looked cool or something to a kid. And then, of course, when I was in high school, maybe I thought about being a professional football player, which was completely unrealistic. But when I first really started seriously thinking about what to do with my life in terms of what was within my own capacity, or fit my my particular skill sets. When I was 15, when I first started studying physics in high school, I was very intrigued by physics, and I found that I had a fairly reasonable aptitude for it. So I thought seriously about becoming a professional physicist. And my thinking, although I didn't know it at the time because I didn't have enough understanding of really what the different disciplines were, but I think really what I was interested in was philosophy. But to me, it seemed that maybe this would be a way to explain how everything works. But as the next couple of years as a teenager, when I started recognizing my own mind and how my mind wasn't functioning exactly how I wanted it to be, and also because my father was a psychologist, I had started getting interested in psychology and took some courses in psychology. And then in philosophy, and then in Buddhism, and then that's what I ended up focusing on most of all. But certainly that was part of my interest, was on trying to understand the mind. And so I've certainly read a lot about psychology and the history of psychology. Again, I'm not an expert on it. I had to take one college course in psychology only. Actually, I took one college level course before I was in college, and then another one in college. So I guess you could say two college level courses on psychology. But I've continued to read a lot about it as a monastic. So the other things I've mentioned also, I really like to look at the history of things in terms of their development. So like with Western psychology, a book that I read a couple of years ago that I was hoping to read for a long time because I'd heard about it other places, that some of you might know, I don't know, is the book called The Discovery of the Unconscious by Henry Ellenberger. It's must be 54 years old now. It was written in 1970. When it came out, it was a quite well-received book. It's considered one of the great sort of, how do you say, works of psychological history that's been written. It's, I think, well over 1,000 pages. It's a book about the history of dynamic psychology. So it traces psychology actually back to the mid-18th century, that its development in Western culture out of spiritual movements, sort of faith healing. This is where he sees the basis of Western psychology. It doesn't mean that Western psychology is necessarily based on faith healing, but how that became, where it grew out of, and how that affected its trajectory. And then through the 19th century and developments, and then he focuses especially on four major psychological figures in the early 20th century and late 19th century, which are Pierre Janet, and then Freud, Jung, and Adler, who was another student of Freud's. So a lot of people would see those as outdated these days, especially Freud has been, maybe even some people would say, discredited in a lot of circles. But at the same time, it's very important for understanding the foundations of Western psychology, and also about a lot of ideas that we hold about the nature of the mind. And what I also was interested in that book, definitely lived up to its reputation, was how it demonstrated what these people grew out of. Why was Freud asking the questions he was asking? And it's clear that they were more than just clinical psychologists. They were also philosophers in a deep way, and they were trying to explain who we are. Freud's psychology grew out of philosophy. It seems it's actually a lot of his influences were philosophers. Like Nietzsche was one of his main influences, and he was trying to make that philosophy into a therapeutic setting. How do we treat somebody? So that already makes it quite distinct in a lot of ways from Buddhist psychology, because Western psychology grew out of trying to heal people who have mental disturbances, whereas Buddhist psychology, of course, it recognizes that in general people have mental disturbances. It's a universal thing, but it wasn't intended for people who we would in normal parlance consider mentally ill. It was actually intended for people who were relatively stable, because in the Buddhist Sangha, they didn't want to accept people into the Sangha who were going to create disturbances. They just couldn't handle that. It was an itinerant group. They couldn't take in patients, essentially. It had to be people who were quite well adjusted, who then wanted to develop their minds in a much more deep way, develop their potential, which has some resonance nowadays, what they call positive psychology, the idea that psychology isn't just about healing mental illness, it's about developing the natural potential of human beings. So what this author, Ellenberger, he sees this as developing out of faith healing, in the sense that there was the faith healers in the 18th century were trying to heal the mentally ill, and this gradually developed into what some people might know mesmerism, right? Franz Mesmer in France. So this was a major movement in France, which was the major center of science at the time in the 18th century, which then out of that developed hypnosis. One of Mesmer's students, so I forget the name, he was a noble, an aristocrat in France, and he formed this. He essentially discovered hypnosis. He by accident hypnotized somebody and developed into a therapeutic modality that he was able to help a lot of people. And in the 19th century, this gradually developed, this whole movement. And then this was picked up by people like Freud. It wasn't like Freud was the originator of Western psychology. It had been developing for a long time, but for a variety of reasons, Freud became very famous, which, for better or worse. I mean, there was a lot of other people, rivals of his at the time. Janet was one of them. Janet actually was probably the main rival to Freud, in the sense that he would have become the one that became popular, but for various reasons, it was Freud. So although Freud again eventually was kind of discredited because a lot of his ideas were not grounded in a lot of hard evidence and good studies, this has been very influential in the way that the psychology has developed. And it's very much focused on we think about psychology, and most people think about clinical psychology, where it's focused on, for example, a therapy setting. You meet one-on-one with a patient, but it can encompass a lot more than that. And especially, as I said, now with the positive psychology movement, there's more emphasis on trying to increase human potential. So where do we go with this? There's a number of different things to say. But I think, in terms of Freud, as I said, he was a philosopher as much as a psychologist. We have his philosophy. I mean, we could call it philosophy, we call it psychology, but the idea of what is the mind in terms of the ego, the id, and the superego. So this is a very interesting way of presenting things, right? There was a book I read a few years ago. It was quite well done. Was it Modern Psychology and Yogacara Buddhism, I think, by Giang, Giang, the Chinese name, but I think he was an American scholar. So he was comparing Freud and Jung, and then the philosophy of Xuanchuang, who was a great Chinese master, who was essentially a Chittamatra, mind-only school. So it wasn't his own philosophy per se. It was really Chittamatra Buddhism or Yogacara Buddhism. It's the same, the two names for the same school. But he was a great writer within this, and he was writing in Chinese. So I mentioned this in the past few days about the all-ground consciousness, right? So they have this idea of that. I think it was actually this morning that I mentioned that specifically, that there's the all-ground consciousness which exists outside of our ordinary everyday consciousness. And so comparing this to what Freud's idea of unconscious mind, and also then Jung's idea of the collective unconscious. So there's a considerable overlap. It looks like they're looking at a lot of the same questions. Again, it's not in Freud and Jung, they're approaching it very much, especially in Freud, from pathology in terms of treating illness. But at the same time, they have a lot of the same ideas in terms of there being something outside of our ordinary conscious awareness that is manipulating us in ways that that we don't notice. But I think the author of that book, he came up with 4 main points of difference that are useful to look at. And I don't know if I can remember all of them now, but I'll try as my best, because all of them are quite useful for approaching this. So one was that in Freud's theory, the id, where the sort of this fountain for desire, where we have all our desires come out of this mysterious unconscious id, it's essentially either random or biological. It's not like it has to do with imprints from past lives, certainly, or necessarily even from things that happened in the past, although certainly Freud was very acutely aware of the influence of childhood experiences. At the same time, it wasn't as though there was one particular action that would create an imprint that then ripens in the future. Whereas in the Chittamatra system, it's not random at all, although it can appear random because we don't understand the full scope of it. Actually, everything that happens has a very particular trajectory of cause and effect, stretching over many lifetimes, and then that affects us now. One of the second things is that it's in Freud's philosophy, it's essentially inaccessible. An ordinary person, there's no talk about accessing your id, except that you go through psychoanalysis, and the psychologist or the analyst tries to understand what's going on there and then helps you with that. But you don't actually go into a deep state of samadhi and access directly what's happening. Whereas in the Chittamatra school, that is the main focus. It's a Buddhist school, it's a meditative school, is to try to transform that through meditation. So then the third thing, which is a corollary of that, is that in Freud's philosophy that you can't fundamentally change it. You learn to manage it. You learn to function in the world as best as you can, despite the anxiety that's created with this strain with the id. And you can certainly become a more mentally healthy person, but it's not that you can just be completely free of desire, and that's not even seen as necessarily a desirable goal. You want to just be as well integrated as you can be. Whereas in the Chittamatra philosophy, it's possible to be completely free of this. There's they call the fundamental transformation of the Alaya Vedana, and then it becomes ultimately the mind of the Buddha. So then I think maybe the fourth thing may have been that, I don't remember exactly, but it may have been that also in Freud that it essentially appears almost as malicious, that it's not that the id is something that's like a benevolent entity that is just gone wrong. It's just the way things are due to evolution. Whereas again, in the Chittamatra philosophy, there's Buddha nature, that actually the fundamental nature of the mind is something pure that can be accessed. So those are some major points of difference, even though there's a lot of overlap. And then, of course, there's the difference in terms of then how it's applied, which again, because in Freud, he's working with mental illness, whereas in the Chittamatra, it's applicable to everybody, and everybody is able to access this and transform it. But anyway, I mean, these are, Freud had a tremendous impact on Western culture also, and that's what this book focuses on. It's just as much as about Freud in the actual psychology as how it manifested in ordinary culture, and the degree to which, even though nowadays people don't necessarily follow Freud's ideas, they've had a tremendous impact on the culture. And people have this idea of unconscious drives that we have, some of which are grounded in a lot of evidence, and some of which are just kind of pop ideas. One manifestation of that would be, for example, the thought that anybody who, because this was something Freud was actually explicit about, is that anybody who's following a spiritual path is kind of deluding themselves, that really it's their goal is some kind of more instinctual drive, but it's sublimating itself into trying to act as though they're holy. Now, maybe that view might be more prevalent especially in Western culture than it would be in Indian culture. I don't know, but certainly in the U.S., I would say it is quite a strong view, whether people voice it or not. People are very skeptical of anybody trying to follow a spiritual path. It's not seen as, most people have pretty doubtful that somebody could actually have pure motives for doing so. There must be some other thing. They must have had some traumatic childhood that they're trying to escape from by following that path. And then, so that I was talking about how it influenced the culture, and then nowadays, today, as I said, Freud's philosophy or his psychology is not so followed, but there's a variety of different psychology. How do you say? Not modalities, but sort of schools of psychology that have become popularized. When I was in college, I remember they told us that there was 5 that my teacher grouped it into. I don't know if this is universally accepted or just his own opinion. So there was psychoanalysis, which is Freud's school, which he was saying even at the time, 20 years ago, was very much in the decline. And then cognitive psychology, right, which has become much more prevalent, which is focused more on trying to recognize thought patterns that we have that are detrimental, that we might have some idea, for example, I'm never going to succeed, and have that thought very strongly, even though we don't recognize it, and trying to become more aware of that and question it and even debate with it. So we have like dialectical behavioral therapy has grown out of that. And then behaviorism, which also is very much, kind of maybe been integrated, but certainly doesn't exist so much as an independent school anymore. Although in the US in the early 20th century, that was very much the dominant school. And then what was the word he used? I don't remember the word he used exactly. Essentially neurobiology. So the idea that mental illness is rooted in the imbalances in the brain, which has become very popular, maybe even dominant today. And then finally, humanism, which grew out of the ideas, especially of what's the name? Abraham Maslow, and then later is developed into the positive psychology movement, which approaches it from the opposite end, as opposed to trying to look at mental illness. It's saying we want to allow people to realize their full potential. So that has, some overlap with Buddhism. I would say of those five, the two that have the most in common with Buddhism would be cognitive psychology and humanism. So here there's a great opportunity, and really it's already happened in a lot of ways for Buddhism to make a contribution. It's probably been the first way that Buddhism has interacted with modern science. Certainly with cognitive psychology, that idea resonates strongly with the Buddhist idea that what we call in Tibetan, the word is sulmanichiki namdok. I don't know the word in Sanskrit. I think namdok is vikalpa, but sulmaniche, I'm not sure. But essentially what this means is inappropriate mental engagement. But one friend of mine, he said that he feels a word that is used nowadays in cognitive psychology that he thinks captures what this is saying is the term maladaptive cognitive appraisals, which means that we frame any situation we're in a particular way. We say this person is trying to harm me, or everyone is against me here, or the opposite could be that I'm more important than the others in this room, something like that. And that appraisal is maladaptive in the sense that it's incorrect. It's not actually a correct appraisal of what's going on, but it does not lead to skillful behavior. So that is essentially what is meant by sulmanichiki namdok in Buddhist philosophy, that we have this undercurrent of thoughts that's going on that distorts our picture of reality. This has to do with habituation to these thought patterns, and therefore things appear to us differently than they actually are. And this goes very deeply. So in Buddhist philosophy, it goes much more deeply than it would in Western psychology, in as much as it has at the coarser levels, it has a lot of overlap. We frame things in terms of things that make us angry. We make this whole story of why this person is bad, and there we get angry at them, even though it's not really assessing the person in a full way. But at a deeper level, it's the way that we think about reality. We think about things as permanent when they're impermanent, and even more deeply, we think about things as existing in an inherent way. So we think about subject and object, and who we are in a more philosophical sense. So why am I here in this universe? How do I relate to each other? What is the relation of body and mind? All these things. We have a particular thought pattern that's going on that is affecting the way that we experience it in our conscious awareness. So with that, the approach, as I understand it in Western psychology, although nowadays there is a lot of integration of meditation, especially what they call mindfulness meditation. I even read some. There's a couple of quite mainstream sort of conservative say psychological commentators that I used to read. I mentioned Scientific American quite a few times. We used to read that in the house. We don't get it anymore. But they had, for 6 years, they had Scientific American Mind. They no longer publish that, which was quite interesting to us. And in that, these writers, they had a monthly column where they would critically analyze some movement in psychology, and often in quite insightful ways. So they took on mindfulness, and actually they were very positive about it. They said, there's this whole mindfulness movement, and they weren't themselves involved in it per se. They didn't have any crossover with Buddhism. But they said, this whole mindfulness movement today, does it withstand scrutiny? And they said, yes, basically. A lot of the studies show that it is very effective. So that has been adopted in a lot of circles of cognitive psychology. But then, of course, the therapy part is also an essential part of it, that the therapist works with the person to help them to recognize, first of all, what are the thought patterns they're having, and then to start to debate with them to say, is that correct? So that is, His Holiness, the Dalai Lama has even said, that is analytical meditation. His Holiness met with Aaron Beck, who is I believe, a cognitive psychologist, and said that exact thing. Aaron Beck described the work he's doing, and His Holiness said that is analytical meditation. That Aaron Beck was quite surprised. But this is what Buddhist philosophy is aimed at. That is what Buddhist meditation is. This is why Tsongkhapa was so clear about the importance of analysis. That you can't just think, you just go into meditation and you sit there and clear your thoughts. It doesn't. That can have some benefit in terms of gaining concentration. So in certain circumstances, that is a good way to meditate, but it shouldn't be seen as the only kind of meditation. Really, what you need to do with that is analyze things. So some of you might know Shantideva's great text, the Bodhisattva Charyavatara. So the 6th chapter of that text, I think, really should be included among the great classics of world literature, really the whole text, but the 6th chapter is just exceptional. It's all about how to debate with anger, how to overcome anger through cognitive therapy, and but not therapy in the sense of talking to someone, but just working with your own mind. Right? The Buddhist approach is to meditate and then become aware of what is your mind saying, what reality is it creating, and then try to debate with that. So Shantideva brings in all kinds of different ways to debate with our
So 8 levels of negating the cognitive errors, right?
6 or 8 levels of negating cognitive errors, you're saying, in that text. Yeah. Well, I'm not sure. I mean, you may be right. I haven't seen it presented that way, but you might be very well right that I mean, the text doesn't explicitly say 6 or 8 levels, but there might be a commentator who has framed it that way. Yeah. So were you taught that in your course? Or
do this, and then if that also doesn't work, then do this.
Yeah. So yeah, I think in the 6th chapter he is saying that, and so one of the commentators, maybe Gyaltsab, who's the Gaelic commentator, has framed it that way, that it's you just, because that's often how they do it. The ancient Indian texts often were not organized in a specific way. Here's this, now this, but then if you look at it, you can draw these patterns. You can see what he's trying to say, and so the Tibetan commentators would have organized it that way. Yeah, so that's exactly that. He's analyzing it from all different angles. It's called Bodhisattva Charyavatara. In English, there's many translations. It's often translated as a guide to the Bodhisattva's way of life. I'm sure we can find it for you here. And it's available online, I know. I think Tibet House, probably you can get it from them. So, just to give some of the examples, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. So, like in the 6th chapter, one of the early verses about Dira mira shindanu nini shindu gyuwatar, deja mira shindani negi nyen yomon kewar gyur, which is saying, although you don't want it to occur, an illness just arises through causes and conditions. And likewise, although somebody doesn't wish it to occur, the afflictions simply arise in their mind. So this is talking about how do we reflect on when we see somebody else who is very afflicted, they're full of anger. So rather than responding to them on their level and just getting angry back, we look at them like a sick person who's afflicted by something they can't control. They're afflicted by their own mental state. He says, like, right before that verse, he says that, like, if you have the elements, when the elements are out of balance, then the person gets sick, but you don't get angry at the elements. So why should you get angry at the person who's out of balance due to their mental afflictions? So that is one way of thinking about it, is in terms of the person themselves and seeing them as something that's out of control. And then later he says, usually it would come to mind, but you belong anyway. I'll say it in English rather than trying to recite the verse. But it's just saying, that if somebody hits you with a stick, right, then you don't get angry at the stick, even though the stick is what's directly hitting you. But you get angry at the person who's impelling the stick. But why get angry at the person if they're being impelled by their own anger? Why not get angry at their anger? Right? So you have to see everything as a process of causes and conditions. This is one very powerful way to break this down. This also has to do with the understanding of selflessness, that there's no real person there. There's just a process of causes and conditions that are leading to that. And this person is out of control. There's not anybody deciding, I want to be angry. And there's no anger that comes from its own side saying, I want to be angry. It's just a process of causes and conditions. And then also, right after that, saying, this is one of my favorite verses, is Dei Tsondagi Lu Nika Dunga Juyen Day, Dei Tsondagi Lu Jung Day, Banchiglani Troarche. So his stick and my body have both arisen due to causes and conditions. He has a stick and I have attained a body. With which should I be angry? Right? So if somebody hits me, there's two things going on there. There's the stick, and then if I didn't have a human body, I wouldn't be able to experience pain. So I'm contributing to it too by being here. Right? But the point is to focus on, what did you contribute to this situation, right? And if you want to be born in samsara, in a human body, which essentially is coming in Buddhist philosophy from your own craving that's leading to your birth, then you're going to have to expect that this is going to happen. He then goes on to say it's like having an open wound. Like you walk around. Actually, he says this in the 5th chapter, but it's relevant here. He said you walk around with an open wound, and then you keep bumping up against people and it hurts. Well, that's what you get for walking around with an open wound. And so when you have this body, which is like a wound, he says, then why do you get angry at everything that you can brush up against that keeps irritating you? You have to recognize, what can you do to heal your own sickness so that you don't keep getting irritated by everything you encounter. And then later in the chapter, there's the whole section on seeing the enemy as beneficial. So it starts with the verse, Dei sonam gekche pa, delian tro mirik de, so some kind of yumina, ganchi ko yumina dani de la mine sam. So it's saying, right, so you could say, well, I will get angry at him, because the person who's harming me, because he's obstructing my merit, right? I'm trying to be a religious practitioner and do meritorious things, and this person is getting in the way of that. But then he says, but there is no greater virtue than patience, so why don't I practice patience, right? So it doesn't make any sense. So then to get angry at the person, thinking that they're obstructing your merit when they are the source of your merit. He goes on to say that there's really, without somebody to make you angry, there'd be no way to practice patience. So then there'd be no merit. So one of the later verses is Gere de la noche we samyo chuja minche na nebashindu pengirna dagi so. So he says, right, so okay, because it's a constant debate with how the mind might come back with opposing ideas, because this is what happens, right? If we don't pay attention to. We have to pay very careful attention to what our mind is framing things as, that we might come up with this idea that, okay, this enemy is helpful because he's helping me practice patience, but the mind might actually subtly be making a different analysis of it. And it might come back with saying, well, okay, but first of all, he is allowing me to practice patience, but he doesn't have that intention. There's not somebody there thinking, oh, I want to make him happy by practicing patience. So why should I feel, thankful to him? He's not really trying to help me. But then he says, but then why should you feel thankful to the Dharma for the gift it's given you? The Dharma doesn't have any intention to help you. But then he comes back within that the enemy not only doesn't want to help me, he's actively trying to hurt me. But then Shantideva comes back with, well, if he was like a doctor and everybody around me was just trying to help me all the time, then how would I ever develop any kind of patience? Right? We have to, have some kind of toughness in our mind, not think that everybody should always be there trying to help me. If we really want to be a spiritual practitioner, we have to see that every situation is our opportunity to practice. It's not up to other people to come and make all the conditions conducive for us. Because earlier on, he also had the verse, right? That Dani Tonia Donir La, Niedon Korni Migo Shing, Dani Chod Gek anyway, he's saying that I am a spiritual practitioner who's focused on liberation, and I have no need of praise and wealth, right? So if somebody is assisting me in my spiritual practice by helping me to diminish my pride about my fame and my wealth, what possible reason is there to be angry? Right? We have to think about what is really my goal here. Nobody can possibly obstruct you from liberation. They can only obstruct you from things that are going to continue your stay in samsara. So anyway, I think a lot of you already know this text, and those of you who don't, you're welcome to take a look at it. It's very useful. But essentially, this is cognitive psychology. To me, it's more advanced cognitive psychology than a lot of what's available today. The advantage today, which is certainly worth considering, is that there is therapeutic psychology, right? In ancient times, there wasn't a lot of outreach maybe to people who were really mentally ill and needed intervention. Right? It was more about subduing your own mind. But really, in a lot of ways, all of us need intervention. Not all of us need somebody to come and do the work for us by talking to us, but we need to intervene with our minds. Our minds are not going in the right direction all the time, or much of the time. And so these are ways of addressing these issues. So yeah, as I said, this isn't something that I'm telling anybody any new news. It's already become very clear the tremendous overlap with psychology in this department in terms of cognitive psychology. And then the other one I mentioned, humanism, also has a lot in common with Buddhism. One difference at least is that it underestimates human potential, I would say, compared to what Buddhism says is possible, right? I mean, humanism, there's many different manifestations of it, but especially the positive psychology movement, which has become sort of, in some sense, a little bit more watered down than the early thinkers like Maslow, is that it's very much still rooted in the materialist framework. And maximizing human potential means essentially allowing people to become, very well functioning within normal society, as opposed to any talk of allowing people to become fully enlightened beings, which is what Buddhism is focused on. What's that? Yeah, there's the compassion focus. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's one thing I do want to talk about is altruism. So I'll try to get to that. So maybe I've talked a bit about psychology, and as I said, this is, it's a very broad thing, and it's not, I don't want to get too sidetracked with too many different things because there are other subjects. But I guess the last thing I'd say about psychology is another book I read, which I often talk about in talks like this some years ago. I don't know if any of you know, is the book Irreducible Mind, which came out, I think 2007 it was published. I would say this is among the best books I've ever read. So if I get to the subject today, if I have time, I don't know if I will, about psi and so forth. If someone is interested in issues of things like psi and near-death experiences and other things outside of the realm of we say materialist psychology or materialist philosophy, there are a lot of books I would recommend, but if you have the time and energy, this is the best one. It encompasses a lot of the different ideas and in a very cohesive and forceful way. So there's several authors. The main author is Edward Kelly. So if you could just search for that, but it's a collaboration of several people. Irreducible mind. Irreducible. Yeah. Because the point being that, right, in reductionist science or reductionist philosophy, which materialism is very much a reductionist philosophy, it's that mind is supposed to be reducible to neural states. I mean, anything should be reducible to something else. So, for example, we say with ice, why is ice solid? Well, because we can reduce it to the formation of the molecules. Right? So mind should be reducible to something else, and you can reduce it to the behavior of the neurons, and that can explain mind. And their argument is that it's not possible. Mind is irreducible. It's not something that can be reduced to a non-mental thing. So they argue that through variety of both reason and evidence. There's 8 chapters, as I recall, to the book, which to me were progressively better and better in terms of their arguments, and also just things I hadn't heard before other places. So some of the early chapters, there's a whole chapter on memory we talked about earlier. There's a chapter on near-death experience. The last 2 chapters I thought were the best. The 7th chapter is on creativity, which I had not considered before, but now I think very important, because they show how materialist science and materialist psychology has failed to account for human creativity. It's just very difficult to explain how people can be very creative and not just, I think it's 6th chapter is creativity, the 7th chapter is genius, which follows from that. And it's really when they focus on genius, because they talk about what they call Wind's principle in science, which is that the extraordinary can help us understand the ordinary. The ordinary tells us nothing about the extraordinary. So that we can do all we want focusing on ordinary minds and people, the way ordinary psychology functions. It won't give us any hint that there might be something extraordinary. But if we focus on the extraordinary cases, it might tell us a lot that we didn't think about in terms of how the ordinary mind functions. And we look at some people who have extraordinary levels of genius. For example, in India, Ramanujan, they use that as one of their case studies. How does that possibly happen? It doesn't fit any paradigm of how mind functions in terms of the idea that it's just this rational putting together of old ideas into new ones, which doesn't seem to be what's happening there. So it implies that maybe ordinary mind doesn't function that way either. So anyway, in that book, their basis for the entire book is the philosophy or the psychology of Frederick Myers. This is why I brought it in here. So Myers, I mentioned earlier about Freud and then his contemporary Janet, but there were other people that were also functioning at that time, and one of them was Myers, who was a British psychologist, who were vying for kind of the dominant paradigm within psychology. And for a variety of reasons, Freud's became adopted, even though it was later discarded. But Myers had a completely different paradigm of things. He was in discussion with these people. He was a close friend of William James, and there's a lot of crossover with James. And what a lot of people might not know about William James, I don't know if you do, but William James was also very interested in psi phenomena, in clairvoyance, things like that. His magnum opus, Principles of Psychology, has 2 chapters on clairvoyance, which are no longer in the book. They have abridged the book. He didn't ask them to do that, but modern, studies of psychology in universities, they don't consider those, it's kind of an embarrassment that he spent so much time on that. Well, yeah, I mean, James was focused. That was. I used the word clairvoyance. Actually, it's not the right term, right? In the clairvoyance, I use because colloquially, it's a term that people know. But in their, within their discipline, in terms of their technical language, right? I think for them, clairvoyance would be being able, would be especially remote viewing, and then they have another word for knowing the contents of somebody else's mind, right? But essentially, their main term is psi, PSI, as I said before. So then psi has 2 main manifestations. One is active and passive. So passive psi is knowing things that we could not know through ordinary means of sense impressions, right? So remote viewing and also clairaudience, right? Hearing things or just knowing information. And then active psi will be sometimes called psychokinesis, being able to control things, right? So James did a lot of studies of this, especially most of all, he studied one particular person, a woman in Boston named Lenora Piper, who he gathered a lot of evidence for her over many, many years. She was what we call a psychic. And he thought that, there were a lot of frauds out there, but he thought she was very genuine and had something like this whole WINS principle, that although she was one person, James used the statement some of you may have heard. So he said that it's not, if I want to prove that not all crows are black, I don't need to prove that all crows are white. All I need to do is find one white crow, and I've shown that that there's no law that crows have to be black. So Lenora Piper is my white crow. But with her, I've proved that, or at least demonstrated that the human psychology is not limited to what we ordinarily ascribe it to. If you're interested in James, I mean, that was a side thing, but there's an excellent book about his work and also covers Myers of Sophisticated Amount. It's a book called Ghost Hunters by Deborah Blum, B-L-U-M, because they were also focused on ghosts. Myers, actually, that was one of his main focus, was about trying to understand ghosts. They were founders of the Society for Psychical Research in Britain, which was a very serious scientific enterprise. Most of their work was focused on debunking people. For example, some of you might know Madame Blavatsky, right? They came to India. The person they sent to India was the Australian, forget his name. But anyway, this person they sent to India, he debunked her according to them. I mean, I don't know if or how do you call it, the group that they have. I forgetting the name, but anyway, her group, the one that located Krishnamurti, right? They I don't know if they accepted it as debunking, but according to the Society for Psychical Research, they were quite satisfied that he had proven she was a fraud. But this same person, this Australian, was the one that they brought to Boston to examine Lenora Piper, and it was quite the opposite. He was convinced that she was genuine, and even had his own experiences with her. It's interesting. He died while he was investigating her, and then she supposedly channeled him later, and again did so with quite relevant information. For example, in one of the channels, he admitted that he had proposed marriage to a woman in Chicago, unbeknownst to any of his colleagues, and that she had rejected him. And they investigated it, and that was correct. There's no apparent way that Lenora Piper could have known that. Okay, so anyway, my point was about Myers, because in Myers was interested in these phenomena, but not just for the sake of gathering evidence. He was trying to make a comprehensive picture of human psychology. And he thought, like James did, that this was essential, that it's not enough just to look at ordinary human psychology. We have to look at a lot of the outlier cases to make a full picture of what is happening. And the authors of Irreducible Mind feel that Myers was much more on the right track than any of the other people at the time, and that they feel that psychology has gone in a very circular direction through the 20th century, because they're writing in 2007, just after the century had finished, that because it has not incorporated a lot of evidence that is available, because the materialist framework will not allow for it, it fails to really explain how human mind functions, and therefore just goes in circles again and again, through kind of popular fads that fail to actually get to the heart of what's going on. And so Freud becomes popular, then behaviorism becomes the dominant paradigm, at least in America, and then other things, but all of them are ignoring a great deal of what's actually happening in human psychology. So anyway, that is just, I know I said I was just going to mention that briefly, but I think that, to me, that is, one of the most important things in terms of psychology and how it is relevant with Buddhism. And also, as I said yesterday, in terms of when there's a Buddhist principle that is challenged by modern evidence or psychology, we have to think about modifying it. And to me, a lot of the Buddhist principles are excellent guidelines, but a lot of the things I've read in the past 10 years or so, for example, in Irreducible Mind and other books, they don't always fit directly into the Buddhist ideas. It definitely makes the possibilities of things like clairvoyance and reincarnation, which are essential parts of Buddhist philosophy, as seem very possible, but doesn't necessarily mean that they happen in exactly the way that they are traditionally presented. Sort of like I was saying yesterday, that there's Mount Meru and the continents around it, and then the levels of hell below that, and the God realms above that. They might be talking about something very real in terms of their what? Well, my point is just that they might have, maybe some people had some very real experiences. The idea was, how do we know about these things? Well, because the sages experience it directly in their meditation, right? Maybe they did experience something very real. Even the Buddha himself warned against this. Yeah, and it's an allegorical way too. That's true. And that's, as I said, what kind of language would they use today if they were going to describe their experiences? But the Buddha himself warned people that a very strong source of wrong views is that people gain some degree of clairvoyance, and they experience some piece of what's going on, and then they make a whole philosophy based on that. That is only a small piece of what's actually happening. So it's entirely possible that even later generations of Buddhists could have fallen into that same trap, or that, as you suggest, it may not be that a trap for them per se, but that people were trying to describe something, and they may have had a very enlightened view of it, but that it doesn't necessarily mean that the way it's been recorded or even understood today is necessarily in accord with that. So it seems that the issue is much more complex. In Irreducible Mind, they give an extraordinary challenge to the materialist view, and to me, it's almost, it's quite conclusive. After reading that book, I felt that they really conclusively overturned the materialist paradigm. But it opens up a lot of things. They have some very good ideas that they present, but they admit that they're not presenting a final philosophy. It's opening it up to possibility. And Buddhist philosophy, again, there's a lot that it can contribute. I think most of all is, as I started yesterday with, that in this tradition, the methodology that it can contribute of how to approach this. How can we think about it? How can we debate about it? How can we incorporate it into our own practice without falling into a kind of dogmatic view? That's not what it has to be. And that's not really what Buddhist philosophy is about. It's meant to be open to new developments. Yeah. Okay. So we've got, if we had the ordinary schedule, we've got about 20 more minutes. So I think in interest of that, in terms of what to focus on, I think maybe I'll just, yeah. Okay, we'll try to do that. Yeah. Okay. Okay, I'll do that. And then he had asked about social responsibility also, so I'll try to focus on both of those. But if reincarnation, that's good. I'm glad that you're interested in that.
Your karma is going to bring you back again to this place.
Yeah, to finish the talk, right?
Finish the talk. That's okay.
Okay, so in terms of reincarnation, yeah, okay, I will try. I'll be in India for a while. Yeah, we'll have to see with the schedule, right? It's a matter of it's very hard. I'm very, very busy in the monastery, and within 2 years when I start the Dharamsala class, it'll be more busy. So it's going to be, and that also in the Dharamsala class, there's no possibility of getting permission to leave. So that makes it difficult. But it's usually this time of year, from about December to March. And I think before too long, I'll probably end up being involved in the preordination course in Dharamsala, which would mean every year I'd have to come through here. So at least once a year, we'll see. We'll just have to see as the years go on. Anyway, we'll talk about that afterwards. But in terms of reincarnation, okay, so that's also useful because in Irreducible Mind, they don't actually talk about reincarnation. They do dedicate the book to Ian Stevenson, which is very telling. They dedicate it to two people, to Myers and to Stevenson. And they cite his work a lot, but they don't talk about reincarnation. I would suspect probably because it's an open, we might say in colloquials, opening up a whole different can of worms, right? Their intention is to overturn the materialist paradigm. And there was one woman who came to Tufts, to Sera a few years ago, a Harvard professor, who was giving a talk to the monks about the interaction of Buddhism and science. And Geshe Namdak, some of you might know, he was there, and he asked her, what do you think about evidence for example, reincarnation, and also this Sai, as I mentioned before, because she wasn't talking about that. She was just talking about, how meditation can lead to greater happiness, things like that. And she said she wouldn't share directly her personal view on it, but in terms of her professional work, it would be counterproductive to try to present that because the audience she was working with was very traditional psychologists. And to try to even get them to accept the idea of meditation as being beneficial for psychology was a big step. If you then bring in things like reincarnation, they're not going to listen to what you're saying. You just become, too out there. So I think also with Irreducible Mind, although the authors may have, personally had some interest in it, they don't let on one by the other. But probably they didn't want to get in the way of their main thrust of the book. Anyway, so Ian Stevenson, I think, is by far the best way to approach it if somebody's interested in a scientific approach to reincarnation. There have been a number of different studies. There may be many that I'm unaware of, but we have quite a lot of books in our library at Sera. We have one section for scientific studies on reincarnation and a whole separate section for Ian Stevenson's work. So some of the studies focus on things like hypnosis, right? So people who can go into past life regression, which is very interesting, and I wouldn't discourage anyone from reading it, but it has its limitations. One is that it's simply very easy to discredit. Like just because I can say I can remember a past life, well, who cares, right? No, it doesn't have any proof to somebody who's a skeptic. And also, it may, in many cases, be the result of projection. Right? Just because somebody has go in hypnosis, remember such and such thing, I'm very open to the possibility that in many cases they are remembering something valid, but it could be that they are also it's just a representation of some kind of internal mental state, or it could be a combination of the two. So it doesn't have a lot of proof, although if someone actually is interested in the topic, it lends another dimension to it, which is very important. whereas Stevenson's approach was very much about identifying evidence, right? It was, and it mainly focused on childhood memories, people who were young children who spontaneously recollected past lives, rather than people who did so through any kind of intentional means, such as past life regression. So for probably 50 years, I think, Stevenson was doing this work. But I mean, I don't know if some of you might know, but he was the chair of the Department of Psychology at University of Virginia. But he had a personal interest in this discipline, and so he, at once he had already established himself in the career, which is important, because as I said yesterday, if somebody tries to make their career out of this, it's very difficult, especially in the 1950s. But because he already had tenure as a professor, he had freedom to decide what he wanted to focus on. But he had a difficult time getting funding for it. Finally, as I understand it, the founder of the Xerox Corporation decided, they gave him a grant that he essentially had enough money to continue the work for many years. So until he died in 2007, he was traveling all over the world, gathering information about reincarnation in different cultures. And his main approach was to locate children, it wasn't limited to children, but it was mainly focused on children who claimed to remember past lives. And then, as much as possible, try to isolate them and examine the situation with as much objectivity as possible. And being a scientist already, he knew how to create, a scientific paper, and with a hypothesis and a methodology and abstract and all the all the steps within the within the investigation to make it credible to other scientists. So, for example, he would locate a particular child. This child says, "I was such person, such and such place," and then, as much as possible, first of all, try to investigate where the child could have possibly, through other means, obtained that information. And then to go to that place, if possible, with the child, and document exactly how the child reacted to each step of the way. So do they know the way to the place? Some of them did. Some of them would say, take this turn down this road. And then identify the family and see exactly how the child reacted when they first met family members. Did they recognize people? Did the information that they had provided about that previous lifetime, did it match with the information about whatever person had died in that family that they could identify with this child? So he gathered about 3,000 cases all over the world, but mainly focused on places, of course, where reincarnation is generally accepted. And to the claim that people sometimes made to him that, well, you're just focusing on, sort of the people who already believe it, of course, are going to remember it. His response, which he demonstrated with evidence from his research, was that it happens everywhere, but it's mainly in cultures where people accept reincarnation that the parents listen to what the child is saying. So he did actually he did gather evidence in Europe and America. He has an entire book on Europe. And in most cases there, the first response of the parents with the child was essentially shut up. Either, this is sacrilegious because we're Christians, we don't believe in this reincarnation, or we're materialists and there's no such thing as reincarnation. And it was an embarrassment for the family, which in some sense makes it a stronger case. But it meant that there were much fewer cases that he was able to locate. So the places that he had the most cases were India, Sri Lanka, Burma, Alaska, because there's a group of Native American Indians there. In Brazil, in one part of Brazil where there's some indigenous people that believe in this. Also, I think Nigeria, he spent quite a bit of time in Turkey, also because some of the more native religions in Turkey, rather than the dominant Muslim religion, have beliefs in reincarnation. I may be missing a couple, but those are the main sources of his investigation. So yeah, as I said, about 3,000 cases, and among those, about 900 of the cases included birth defects or birthmarks, which he considered the strongest cases, because in this case, there was something in the child that was obviously not faked. You know, the child was born with such particular birthmark or birth defect that somehow matched the manner of death of the person they claimed to remember the past life of. So that, of all of his work, I think that if someone, again, as I said, with irreducible mind, if someone is very patient and really wants to go through it, is one of his last books, which was called Reincarnation in Biology. It's a 2-volume book, 2,000 pages. The first volume is birthmarks. The second volume is birth defects. So he put together all of the cases that fit into that, into those categories over many years. And some of them are stronger than others. And he's the first to admit when a case is weaker, and doesn't try to overestimate the facts when a case appears very strong. But some of them are quite, I would say, strong and very difficult to explain through any other means. One of the cases that I've often heard cited by other people, and I think it's worth citing here, is a case in Turkey of a young boy who was born with his ear basically, sort of like this, basically it's like a little stump of an ear. And the right side of the face was pretty much shriveled around up to the ear. So from a young age, he claimed that he had been a person in a village several towns away that had been shot in the side of the head. And he would, as soon as he was as soon as he was able to speak, he would start going to that village and throwing rocks at this person's house and accusing him of murdering him. So, one of the objections that's often brought against Stevenson is that the parents are somehow inciting this behavior. It's very hard to see why a parent would want the child doing something like that. It's not very helpful. It's going to harm them. There's not much benefit to be gained from the child harassing some person in a village claiming to be murdered. Under investigation with Stevenson looking at this case, that this had happened. Whether the murder was murder or not was not clear. But there had been a person who fit many of the details, and actually also the mother had a dream before the boy was born that a man appeared to her with blood pouring out of the side of his head and claimed to be, she gave the name of the person, and she said, please go away from me. I'm frightened of you. He said, no, I'm staying with you. And that was just as she was becoming pregnant with this child. So this particular person who had been shot by this man who was being accused, and the man in actual life, he had been, the conclusion, because he had been arrested, was that it was an accident. He had thought he was shooting a rabbit. And so he did flee the scene, and they asked him why, which is very telling. Why would you flee a scene? He said because he recognized that he had shot a person, and he was terrified that the man's sons were going to kill him, which was reasonable. So anyway, they convicted him of manslaughter, and he was sentenced to 2 years in jail, and then he came out. So the boy was claiming that he killed him, that it was a murder. But the boy remembered many details of this, and Stevenson introduced him to the family, and there was a lot of interesting recognition of the members of the family. What's also interesting in this story is the boy later changed his mind. Over the years, speaking with this man who had supposedly murdered him, he eventually agreed it was an accident. I misjudged it. I thought you wanted to kill me, but actually it was an accident. And gradually he came to forgive him. And actually the boy went on to develop fairly well. They gave him some surgery such that he didn't look quite so deformed. I think he eventually became a soldier in the Turkish army. So, if you have one case like that, it's might be seen as anomalous, but what's that?
The white crow.
The white crow. Yeah, I mean, now, even just one, but when, there are many, many cases like that. That to me is one of the stronger ones, but there are some weaknesses there that aren't in others. It's hard to find one particular case that has all the strong points, but one of the weakest points in this case is that the towns were fairly close by, and actually the parents did have some knowledge of that family. But there are other cases where that's not the case. There was one case in India, it was in Rajasthan. But the families were far enough away that they had no information about one another. And I think the child that had been reincarnated supposedly were born into a quite wealthy family. And the previous lifetime was a quite impoverished family in a very distant town. So there was no real reasonable way that they could have had any interaction with each other, or a reason, why would if it was an impoverished family, it's quite different. There could be a very strong motivating factor for the parents to want the child to ingratiate himself with this wealthy family. But why would a wealthier one want to be, associated with a poorer family? So anyway, yeah, I would encourage people, if they're interested, to read that. I don't have any more time to go into it. But again, the same principle applies, that as Buddhists, or people who are coming from that intellectual background, we have to be open to the possibility that this does affirm many principles, but it also is challenging. One thing Stevenson said, through his many years of research, he doesn't see any connection in terms of what is traditionally presented as karma. He hasn't demonstrated any examples of people who are facing retribution for their past actions. Now, one response to that, which I think I would respond as a Buddhist if I was debating about this, is that, as the Buddha had said, karma is very subtle. It's not so one-to-one. It's not like in one lifetime you do this and therefore this happens in the next life. These things unfold over a long period of time. Nevertheless, it's important to take note of the evidence and think that it may not be so straightforward. Certainly, one's apparent problem here would be that karma is supposed to be about my actions create my experience, not my so if somebody kills me in this life, it shouldn't harm me in the future life. It should be the opposite. It should harm them. But in a lot of these cases, or most of these cases that he was examining, it was the opposite. The person was killed in the past life, and it was creating trauma in this life. They were shot in that last life, and now they have a birth defect in this life. Or there's a young child, they're having nightmares about their death in the past life. I would respond that it actually does fit in some ways into the Buddhist paradigm. One is that the Buddha said karma does not just ripen once. If somebody has the karma, for example, to have damage to this part of the head, which is not a very particular karma, you don't have like that exact karma, but it can ripen that way. It could ripen as being shot in one life, and then that continues in the next life. But also that karma is not incompatible with the idea of trauma, right? So it's undeniable that a child who is abused can have problems later in life. This doesn't necessarily fit into karma, right? The karma, really, if we just take karma very literally, the child who is abused should thereby have finished the karma to be abused, and now that's over. There's no reason it should continue to harm them. They didn't do anything wrong. But that's not how human psychology functions, and there's no reason that shouldn't continue in multiple lifetimes. If a person has a traumatic death and they don't have any access in that lifetime because they die right away to actually come to terms with that and come to peace with it, it's going to manifest as psychological problems in the future. And again, within karma, we would just say, well, they had very negative karma that ripened and it continued to affect them. There's nothing incompatible with it. But at the same time, there's all kinds of anomalies in his presentation, but the evidence he finds, and that's why, again, it's a sign of his honesty that he doesn't cover it up. In terms of the way that it functions and the way that people appear to be reborn. For example, in some of the cultures, they have beliefs that, what we call it in Tibetan, the Bardo state. There's an in-between state, and some of them don't. And there seems to be some parallel that the ones who don't believe in it don't experience it. Is that because they're biased and therefore they'll only choose children, if it's all fraudulent, that they'll only choose children who are born at the right time? Or does it have something to do with how beliefs create experience? It's not clear, but it's just what he's documenting. And he doesn't have many accounts of what we would call Bardo experiences, but there are a couple One of the strongest ones is in Sri Lanka, which is again one of his strongest cases, I think, in his entire work, which was the was it Wijayaratne, I think is the boy's name. What's that?
Vijayaratne.
Yeah, well, it's W in Sri Lanka in Sinhalese, but I don't know how to pronounce it. So yeah, in this case, the boy recalled not only his past life where he had murdered his fiancée and then been executed, but he remembered 2 lifetimes in between, one in which he was a ghost and one in which he was a bird. And he described this to Stevenson, and this also had psychological impact in this life, that he had quite some mental problems as a youngster and actually thought he was a bird for a period of time as a young boy. So it gives us all kinds of more evidence to think about, which then, for our own practice, I think we can bring that in terms of trying to meditate on these things, trying to see what's really going on. It maybe the Buddhist, philosophy of reincarnation is accurate, but that doesn't mean that it is the final statement on everything. There's a lot more. What is reincarnation? What is reincarnated? Stevenson makes some conjectures about that within his philosophy, and that's why the Buddhists were doing that for a long time, to understand what does it really mean to reincarnate. Is it the same person? Is it a different person? Sometimes Buddhists use the analogy of the one flame lighting another, as opposed to that there's just one solid thing that goes into another. But what is the best kind of analogy? Okay, so yeah, we're running a little over time, and I'll get okay. So you'd asked about social issues. So without getting into it too much, basically, I mean, as I said to you earlier, personally, I didn't say that in the audience here, but yeah, I think a lot of these Buddhist writers, they did talk about social issues in some of their works. They're not the works that we discuss the most, because in the monastery, we're mainly focused on debate and about philosophy. So like with Nagarjuna, in his work, The Precious Garland, there's quite a lot about how to run the kingdom. The text is a letter to a king, advice for a king. But of the 5 chapters of the text, the 4th and 5th, the 3rd and 4th chapter are mainly focused on political theory, or not theory, but kind of how to implement a just society. Those are the ones we don't spend time on in the monastery, because it just doesn't lend itself to debate in quite the same way, although I think in modern times you could definitely find ways to debate it. But so it's there, and it's available to people who are interested in looking through the works of these philosophers, their idea of what would be a more just society. But I think what we do have there in a very deep way in Buddhist philosophy is the idea of cause and effect. This is in the Four Noble Truths, that if you want to be free of suffering, we have to first identify what is it suffering, what is it that we want to be free of, and then identify the cause. Where is that coming from? If we don't identify the root cause, then as much as we try to change what we call proximate causes, like the immediate cause of something, it won't get to the very heart of it. If we don't recognize the cause, it's like trying to treat the symptoms rather than to treat the disease. And then we have to recognize what is the way to get there, what to get out of that. So we have to recognize, first of all, what we call cessation. Right? Is there a possibility to be free of that? And if so, what is the path to be free of that? So that same approach can be used for any kind of problem that we're facing. So, for example, I mean, as many of you might know, Dr. Ambedkar, he applied that philosophy. It's arguable, whether he correctly interpreted it, and that's why it's useful to argue about it, or whether he intentionally didn't interpret it the way it was traditionally done, so because he wanted to make a different point. It's because Ambedkar's stance was about politics, and he felt that to emphasize that the how would we say, the Dalits, I guess, what's the most political but correct way to say it, Dalit class, because he was yeah. So with the Dalits, why are they being oppressed? To say, well, it's because of karma and delusion. It's putting too much blame on those particular people, whereas in that context, that time, it really was a political issue. And so to focus more on the social causes that are leading to these problems. So in Buddhism, we might argue that, well, that's not the fundamental cause. The fundamental cause really is the karma, but at the same time, it's useful in different contexts. There might be different causes we want to focus on. So I said, we want to eliminate the root cause. Sometimes focusing on the proximate cause is also important. We get so focused on, I want to get to the root cause. Sometimes we lose sight of, well, it's not going to change that quickly. In the meantime, we might want to do something about the proximate cause. And then oftentimes with illness, it's the same thing. Yes, of course, you want to eliminate the cause, but the root cause of the disease, but sometimes you need to treat the symptoms first, or maybe that's the only thing you can do. Like, for example, with HIV, there is no cure for HIV, but we've done a very good job of treating the symptoms enough that it doesn't debilitate people in the way that it once did. So in the meantime, that's a good solution. So we have to look at things very broadly and not be, kind of dogmatic about how it has to be. So one particular issue today that I think a lot of us are concerned about, it's something I've thought about a lot too, is the issue of the environment. Probably, in my opinion, the most pressing issue facing humanity and the world. So likewise here, if we say that, yes, it is true that what is the root cause of the environmental crisis? It's human delusion. But is the solution to eliminate human delusion? It would be a great solution, and it's what we should focus on ultimately, but I don't think we'll eliminate all human delusion in time to save the environment, if that's our goal. So we have to think about what is what other steps can we take? What is our responsibility as individuals? It's something I think about a lot as a monk, because we have especially with someone who is trying to practice a bodhisattva path and maintain bodhisattva vows, we have the vow that when we see human suffering or any kind of suffering, not just human suffering, so obviously in this case, there's the great suffering of animals that's being affected. We can't just stand by and say it's not my problem. So, our goal as a monk, we live in the monastery and we try to cultivate our minds. Is that just a selfish thing to do? And that's a question that comes to mind sometimes, maybe less so as I get older. So I think we have to at least be open to different possibilities. I think we also have to recognize, at least for myself, what is our own current capacity? Personally, I do feel some degree of, contentment or happiness in my attempts to live a life that is at least harmful as possible. Being aware of the impact of the environment, trying to contribute as little as possible to that, even though actively I may not be involved in attempts to make change. Of course, as monastics, that is our fundamental goal anyway. As one of my fellow monks said to me many years ago, he doesn't like attending protests. This is when the Tibetans were protesting the Chinese government in 2008. He said, my life as a monk is a protest. I'm protesting against the way that people live their lives that is destructive. I don't feel I need to make a stronger statement than that. And I think, at least for those of us who are ordained, that generally is a good approach, unless you're in the position to really make a lot of, very strong statement. It may not be the role of a monastic to get involved in that, because if all monastics did that, there'd be nobody maintaining the monasteries. But at the same time, we shouldn't be so complacent as to say it's not my problem. We have to think, when can we make a contribution? And what statement can we make? And certainly as monastics, everything we do is going to be scrutinized. People are going to look at how the monks are behaving. And so we have to be very careful. We don't want to send the wrong message and say it's okay to do this and this thing. But for people who are not monastics, you have to think about in terms of what contribution can you make. I think really it has to do with thinking about more deeply about causes. That it's not, we can go out there and protest or make all kinds of statements, but what's really going to be the benefit of that if we don't ground it in some kind of long-term goal, right? So like if somebody wants to cure illness, you first want to train to be a doctor. It's not going to be that useful to go out and try to practice medicine until you've taken the time to train to be a doctor. So you want to develop some kind of skill set that's actually going to be beneficial, that's actually going to contribute something to the issue. And then within that, you have to see what is the best thing you can do. I was going to talk a little bit about, and I won't because I don't have time, but just because it's relevant here. First about altruism, but also about, some of you might know Steven Pinker. Does anybody know? No, I guess, yeah, in America, maybe more people would, but Steven Pinker is an author at now at Harvard. When I was at Tufts, he was at MIT, they're both of those are just nearby to Tufts. And so I learned about him through my teacher, Dennett, originally. So Pinker actually would have been fun, how do you say? Would have played into several of the topics I was going to talk about. One is linguistics, because originally Pinker became famous for his work in linguistics. He was a student of Chomsky at MIT, and although he didn't have he didn't have the prestige of Chomsky in terms of his ideas, in terms of being independent ideas, his writing about it was much more clear. Chomsky's writing is notoriously difficult for people who are not experts, whereas Pinker made Chomsky's work available to a much wider audience through his brilliant writing. He established himself as an exceptional author in that way. But also, he's a psychologist, and he wrote a number of books on psychology, human psychology. But later, what he moved into, and which actually has made him very famous in the past 10 or 15 years, was his studies of human violence and what he considers the major decline in violence over the past 2,000 years and up until now, for the past century, demonstrating very conclusively to me and to a lot of people that the idea that the world is getting more and more violent is just completely wrong. So the first book he wrote about this, which is still cited a lot, is the book "The Better Angels of Our Nature." Came out in 2011. Even just this past week, I read an article in the New York Times that was again citing it. It was arguing with it in a certain point, but the fact that it had to cite the book in order to establish the basis of the article shows that it's still been very, very influential. Anyway, so yeah, this has, because the issues of linguistics and then also with altruism, because in Matthew Ricard's great book on altruism, which I would have, talked quite a bit about if I had time, he also talks about, he has a whole chapter on Pinker's book. But in this context, in terms of the environment, one of the statements that Pinker makes is, and to his credit, I appreciate Pinker a lot, and I also agree with other people that he is an exceptional writer. His books are just so informative and so helpful to read. But he is, of course, a materialist philosopher and quite outspoken about that, and doesn't have much interest. It doesn't seem to have much. Much. What's the way to say it? It doesn't seem to think that religion has a lot to contribute to human development anymore. So within this context, he makes a statement which is quite strong and is interesting for us, religious people to reflect upon, right? So he's talking about the environmental issues in the world and saying essentially that, if human beings were able to develop fusion power, this would make a greater contribution to the human development and solving the environmental crisis. And the way he puts it is then all the all the religious philosophies in the world, something like that. I mean, he says it a little bit more eloquently than I've just said it, but that's essentially the point, that all these attempts, he basically is asserting, which is a fair statement, that religion is a way of trying to cope with human suffering, whereas fusion would solve the problem. If we could create fusion, then there would be no more environmental crisis, because it's a clean energy that is sustainable and also effective, right? It's not like wind power and solar power, which are so weak that people aren't that interested. Although it could be developed, it doesn't have the same dramatic impact that, if fusion was available, everyone would adopt it and no one would be burning coal anymore. But anyway, so his approach is interesting, that, we have to consider that also when we talk about cause and effect. And we could get so focused on, well, the cause is human delusion, and we really need to question our actions and what we're doing. That's true. But at the same time, we can't just close off the possibility that technology could also solve the problem, potentially. We shouldn't just say, oh, technology is evil. And yes, it has created the problem in a lot of ways, but as he demonstrates in that book, human development has not just been a negative process, it's been, in a lot of ways, a very positive process. And so there could be developments that could contribute to that. So I say that just as when we examine cause and effect, we have to consider many different aspects and not just be focused on, it's definitely this one problem, and open to many different possibilities, because there are a lot of things that seemed insurmountable problems in the past that nowadays they don't seem that big of a deal. People forget how big of an issue it seemed in the past. And that's, it's been overcome by newer developments. So anyway, so I won't have the time to talk about a lot of the other points here, but that's perfectly fine. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's good. We can have a guided meditation about altruism. Yeah. So one of the points I wanted to make with altruism. So we have the term bodhicitta, right? So the Sanskrit term bodhicitta, which means a mind of awakening, right? Is the intention to achieve enlightenment to benefit all sentient beings. So there's a synonymous term, which is translated into Tibetan as semke. So as I believe in Sanskrit, if I may not pronounce it correctly, is chitta utpata, which means, so this is what it means actually is my question here. So chitta, again, is mind, same as in bodhicitta. Utpata, as I understand it, could be taken as meaning generating or giving birth to. So that's how it's generally translated. The word semke in Tibetan, because the translations I'm talking about are translating the Tibetan. The word ke in Tibetan, indeed, can mean to generate. So in English, it's usually translated as mind generation. However, I've come to be skeptical whether that's actually a correct translation. What's questionable to me is the Sanskrit. In terms of the Tibetan, in terms of how Tibetans understand the term, I don't think it is a correct translation anymore. So it always had been a question to me, because sem is very clear. It is chitta, it means mind. So ke in Tibetan, I don't know, none of you, this won't make sense necessarily to any of you, but it's spelled bao satakaka akya yakatakya tembuketa ke. So that means there's a prefix baho. So that means that the term ke is not a present tense term, not a present tense verb. It can't be. If it has the baho suffix, it's either future or past tense. It's very unlikely that it's future tense. It wouldn't make a lot of sense to say the mind to be generated, or that it would the mind that's going to be generated. So it's really, you could say, generated mind. But then what does that even mean? Like, generate what mind? Like how does that really describe what it is? We're talking about bodhicitta. And really then mind generation wouldn't be what we'd want to say. We'd want to say the mind that has been generated. So that had always been a bit of a question to me, but I kind of left it at that. And the other question that I'd had in relation to that was this insistence in the Tibetan tradition that semke is a main mind and not a mental factor. It can't be a mental factor, but there was no real clarity as to why not. So a couple of years ago, I read in a comment there by Pabonko Rinpoche, a recent master in the last century, where he described the etymology semke, and he did not describe ke as meaning generation. He said sem, of course, mind, and then he said ke de cherutangwa. So which means ke means to expand, to make bigger. So in Tibetan, that can also be a meaning of the word ke, completely different meaning. I mean, not necessarily completely different, but it has some relation to generation, but it's a different use of the verb. And actually, I think it is a different verb, right? So in Tibetan, the word ke is in to generate, right? So Tibetan usually has both active and passive forms of each verb. So it has a passive form to be born. I was born. It's the same pronunciation. It's spelled differently, but it's just ke, but has different suffix. But I think the word ke, in terms of expansion, it's the active form of the Tibetan verb ge, like in the word sange, which means to flourish or increase, right? So then ke is to cause to increase. So it's an intentional, to cause something to increase. So it's not a very common verb. I don't see it in colloquial. And when I first saw it in text, because I hadn't encountered it, I mistook it for saying generate, but then I learned that it doesn't mean that. So the only other time I've seen it a lot, which in the past couple of years I have seen it a lot because we've been studying Vinaya, is in the Vinaya. It occurs frequently. And there it's used to expand. So one of the examples of that, a monastic has the vow that if a lay person is so kind as to sponsor the making of a robe for you, then you shouldn't go to the tailor and say, please make it bigger, because the lay person has already paid them and asked them to make it a certain length. And so you ask for more, you're kind of ripping off the sponsor, because then the tailor is left in a position to they just give you extra robe cloth, or do they go to the sponsor and say, oh, can you give me a little more money because he wants it bigger than you asked for? And so that's kind of an inappropriate thing to do. So in that case, it's called takpa kepa, to increase the weave, right? So anyway, the reason I bring that up is because when I saw that, it was very interesting to me that Pabonko Rinpoche interprets it this way. It makes a lot more sense, because it's not saying this mind generation, it's called an expanded mind, a mind that has been intentionally expanded. And so I talked to one of the senior monks of the monastery that I often go to with these kinds of questions, and I explained to him the issue. He said, yeah, if the English people are translating it as generation, that's incorrect. They maybe someone looked in a dictionary and saw the word ke means generation, but they don't know what semke means. It does. It means to expand the mind. So that is how the Tibetan tradition understands it. But I checked with one other monk I know, who's a foreign monk, who I mentioned yesterday also is a Sanskrit scholar. And at least his opinion is that Chitta Utpata, the Utpata cannot have that connotation of increase. It only has the connotation of to generate. So maybe we could say that the Tibetan tradition misinterpreted it later. So my interest then in the Vinaya is to locate, because we haven't done so yet. So takye is one example, and also Ngonsen kepa, similar idea as when you ask for a loan. Right, a monk should not ask for, should not give a loan and ask for interest. Right, so again, it's using the word ke, that you're asking them to give you back more than you gave them. So those are both translations of some term from Sanskrit. So I don't know if it's Utpata in that case, or if it's just something completely different. And unfortunately, we don't have the Tibetan Vinaya in Sanskrit. But it would be interesting to find out, because those same vows are also in the Pali canon. So we could potentially find out, and then with Pali, we could allocate what the Sanskrit term was. But it's interesting because it makes a very different twist on what this bodhicitta is, or what they mean by semke, and it makes it a lot more clear why it has to be a main mind, right? Because sometimes it's presented as the desire to achieve enlightenment. But what it's understood as here, and at least in this Tibetan tradition, when they talk about it as expansion, is that because you have the desire to achieve enlightenment, it expands your mind. Rather than calling it expanded desire, which would sound strange, it expands the breadth of your mind. And as my friend in the monastery, the older one, who told me, this is how we understand it, he said, it's like, if you just think about me and my friends and what I want and what they want, and just work for me and my friends and my family, versus you expand your mind to think about all beings and what's best for everybody. That is semke, that is bodhicitta. So really what this is the expansion. So there's a term in modern altruism, we could say. It was coined, I think, by Peter Singer, who's a Western philosopher, Australian, called widening the circle of empathy. So trying to think not just, that we have a natural inclination towards empathy as human beings, but to try to expand that, because we just tend to naturally want the happiness of those around us that we feel close to. So rather than trying to force ourselves to, care for others, because we out of some kind of obligation, to naturally have that sense of empathy expand to think about not just me, but it can be done so. Because oftentimes, we do that, but by the way we cognitively frame things. So in India now, India thinks of it itself as a country. This is India. Somebody who's from Delhi or somebody who's from Karnataka is still part of India. So we have some commonality. And that wasn't the case, as I understand it, in the past. I don't think India was united as a particular country for most of its history. Those were two different countries. Maybe because I don't know, it was the Kingdom of Mysore. And then maybe whatever different ruling class was in power in the north, in different parts of the north. In other countries, that's also been the case, like in Indonesia. Like there was no such thing as Indonesia until 50 years ago or so. It was actually created by the Dutch, we could say. The Dutch conquered a number of different countries and made them part of the Dutch East Indies. And then when they gained independence, they maintained the identity as a single nation, but that wasn't there before the Dutch were there. It's not to credit the Dutch. What they did was not necessarily appropriate, but nevertheless, it created a sense of cohesiveness. And likewise, the opposite thing happened in Southeast Asia, right? With French Indochina. The French conquered a number of countries and called it French Indochina, but when they gained independence, they didn't call themselves Indochina. They became Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia, which are separate nations. So anyway, the way we structure it can affect how we think about things. So if we think about the whole human family, which is a term that His Holiness he often uses, then it affects how we think about other people. A lot of us are used to using those terms these days, so it's good to habituate with thinking that way. The more we habituate with that, this is also, we talked before about the Bodhisattva Charyavatara, the 6th chapter. So the 8th chapter is also excellent. I mean, I didn't mean to overstate the 6th chapter is excellent, but the 8th chapter is also excellent. His Holiness often says, especially the 6th and the 8th chapter. Yeah. So I think we can do a meditation based on that, because in that 8th chapter, the main focus is this practice of exchanging self with others. It's a way of generating bodhicitta, or we could say generating the expanded mind that thinks about not just oneself, but of all sentient beings. So let's try. After talking so much about philosophy, I want to see if the mind can then go into a meditative state. But as I said before, this is the analytical meditation. It's not that we just have to sit here blissing out. It's just about thinking a little differently. So when we talk about the exchanging self with other, why don't we just start, because we are trying to meditate, so we'll just start by sitting quietly for a minute or two to get a little centered, then we can start with it. So if you like, you can focus on your breath or whatever else helps you to come back to groundedness. So we start with the meditation on equanimity, which in this context means that we think about how all beings are equal in wanting happiness and not wanting suffering. So we can think that everyone has different capacities and different behaviors. Some people are more amenable than others to us. But at the heart, everyone is the same, that they want happiness and they don't want suffering. So likewise, Shantideva uses the example of the body, that we don't discriminate between the different parts of the body. Right? My hands are more beneficial to me than my feet, so I give them more care than my feet. We take care of the whole body because it functions as a cohesive whole. None of the parts can function independently of the others. So we can think about all people that way. So oftentimes what's done is to take to mind 3 different people, one that we consider very close to ourselves, and then one that we feel indifferent towards, somebody that we see every day perhaps, but we never really think a whole lot about. They're just there. And then somebody who we have difficulty with, who makes us irritated. And to reflect upon, is that distinction between them, so we sometimes would say the friend, the enemy, and the stranger, is that something inherent to the person, or does this have to do with personal biases? Maybe it's just my limited experience of each of those particular people. So we can just take some time to reflect on that, take to find 3 people and see, is the distinction between them something that is reasonable, or is it just based upon my limited perspective of things? So that very briefly we did that, but when you have time, maybe you can take more time to think about it. So the next step is to think about the disadvantages of self-cherishing, which means if I just think about my own happiness, and my goal in life is mainly to achieve happiness for me or those close to me, those around me, what does that achieve, right? And think about people who've done so, who created suffering for themselves. Was that see how that can manifest and how disadvantageous that can be. And then think about, is there anybody who's acted that way, who has had that mindset, who has achieved what we would consider stable happiness? And so we could think about different kinds of examples and the way that people who are very focused on personal gain, do they create more worry and stress for themselves? Maybe we might see some counterexamples. Maybe we might see somebody and we think, actually, in that case, that particular person really seems to have achieved some kind of stable happiness. And look deeply at that and say, is that just an appearance based on bias, or do we really think that that's the kind of happiness we might want to achieve long term? There are many different ways to think about that. So without getting into all of them, let's just focus on a couple. So that we can focus on those points. Just think first of all about, see in many cases where we do see it quite obvious that somebody working very hard and ardently for their own personal gain just creates destruction for themselves and those around them. And then somebody who we think might apparently have actually created some kind of stable happiness for themselves, and start to examine whether that's actually the case. So we could do those two things. Okay, so then thirdly, the next step is the corollary to that, thinking about all the advantages of cherishing others. So again, we can think about people who mainly are concerned about the happiness of others and work very hard for the benefit of others, or even just ordinary people who aren't necessarily heroes in society, we might say, but as people who generally seem to be concerned about others and not so concerned about me and what I want. And what is the result of that? Are there obvious cases where that really does seem to have made somebody mentally at peace and happier? Are there cases where that seems to have failed, and why? Does it seem to be the case that had they been more selfish, they would have been happier? You have to ask that and see if that's true. So we can just look at those two possibilities. Okay, so then the fourth stage is what we call equalizing self and other. So we start to think, if that's the case, why is it so important that I work for my own happiness? And only that, and not for the happiness of everybody. So there are various stages of this. And for example, we might have a reason. We might say that, well, others suffering doesn't harm me. Then the one rejection of that is, well, then if that's the case, why am I so concerned about planning for my future? That doesn't affect me now. Why shouldn't I just work for every moment of my life, just have happiness right now, as opposed to thinking so much about what's going to happen in the future? And of course, we might object, well, because that suffering of the future, it's still going to be me experiencing it. Now, this is a more difficult question, but we can then ask, is somebody else's suffering just purely affecting them? And does it not also affect me in some way? Is it just purely discrete that I could be completely happy and the rest of the world suffer? Would that really be happiness? Or does happiness have to do with an interdependent thing, that there's some kind of connection between others, and if everyone around us is happy, that will naturally make us happier? Also, we can ask other ways to object to this. Somebody might say, well, even though it's not reasonable, this is just how I want to be. I want myself to be happy. I don't care whether it makes sense or not. But then we can then say, well, things that don't really make sense are things that generally are considered to be harmful. The nature of things is that a correct understanding is more likely to bring us to peace of mind. So we can different ways of reflecting upon this, but essentially trying to see that we want to think equally about self and other. Doesn't mean that we disregard our own happiness, but we see it in the broader context as part of a much greater whole, as opposed to just something that is the only goal in our life. Okay, so then finally, the last of the 5 stages of this exchanging self with other meditation is, we say, Tonglen meditation. So many of you might know that. We actually try to imagine exchanging self with other. Now, exchanging self with other doesn't mean I think others are me and I am somebody else. It means exchanging others suffering for my own happiness. So thinking, may all the suffering of others, may I experience it on their behalf, and whatever merit I create or whatever happiness I have, may it ripen on others who are suffering. May I give that to them. May I offer that to them. So we can also visualize that if we like, as the traditional way of, we imagine breathing in the suffering of others, things that we don't really want to breathe in usually. We try to avoid pollution, but we want to breathe it all in ourselves so that others don't have to experience it. And then breathe out white light, all the merit we've created, that it spreads, it doesn't just ripen on us, but it ripens on others. We can imagine that pollution that actually breaks through this cloud of self-cherishing at the heart, and then exposes this light that we then radiate out to others. Okay, so maybe we can finish there for today. Run quite a bit over time, but I guess those of you who stayed and would have wanted to, you're welcome to have left if you would wish to do so. Anyway, so I hope that was helpful for you. Yeah, we didn't have any question and answer. I suppose if there's anything pressing, I'm not in any kind of hurry. So if anybody wants to leave, please don't feel pressured to stay. But if anybody has anything that they feel very important to ask before we close here. Yes. Yeah, I'll check if people want to put in the chat. But what? Yeah, please say.
What do they do for the people of Gaza, for example, or the people of Ukraine, or any other place which is suffering, experiencing terrible suffering, even in places, even in parts of India? What do we do if we have this idea that this is a result of their karma?
Yeah.
All those little children being blown up,
Mhm.
it's a result of their karma.
Yeah.
How do we manage to have all those ideas in our head?
Okay, so yeah, the question for those of you online also want to hear is essentially, what do we do when we heard about human suffering in other places? And then secondly, also the question of what does it mean to think, well, that's just the result of their karma? We hear about little children, being blown up. Do we just think, oh, it's just their karma for that to happen? So that brings up a lot of questions. So I can't address them all. But in terms of, first of all, how do we personally react to it? We have to, first of all, react with wisdom. So I think the first step, is we have to take care of ourselves. It doesn't mean like at the expense of others, but if we hear about other people's suffering and it causes us to be anxious and depressed, it doesn't help them. It probably is more likely to be harmful than anything else. If we had talked about altruism, would have talked about how there's a study that's been done about 7 different kinds of empathy, some of which are constructive and some of which are not. So empathy essentially means that we resonate with somebody else's suffering. Now, within those 7 kinds, one of them really wouldn't be called empathy, which would simply be that we hear about somebody's suffering, we don't care, which is the response essentially of what we would call a sociopath. It's somebody who really doesn't care about other people's suffering. That is one human condition. Another response is that every time we hear about it, we just feel worse and worse, which is another common response. So to respond to that possibility, it was very nice a few years ago. His Holiness came and spoke here. Not here, actually, in Bangalore. He gave a talk. I felt somewhat fortunate to be a sort of a cog in the wheel of this chain of events that led to this question being asked for this person, because it seemed that for him it was very beneficial. So I went to attend this talk in Bangalore, and the night before, just as I was arriving in Bangalore, I was going to the hotel where I was staying before the talk, and I ran into an Indian on the street, a young Indian man. I can't remember why. I think maybe I was asking him directions or something, but he then asked me, although, what are you doing here in Bangalore and such? And I said, I'm going to this talk with His Holiness tomorrow. And he was very interested. So he said, can I come? Well, I said, it's ticket-only event, and I don't know if there's any extra tickets. But then I found out that the people at CKSL, the Buddhist Center, that they had a couple extra tickets. So he was able to get a ticket. And he came, and then at the end of the talk, although there were several thousand people there, he was able to be at the front of the line to ask His Holiness a question. So he asked His Holiness, what do we do when we hear about news in different parts of the world that makes us very sad? So His Holiness gave an answer that for this young man seemed to be very, very helpful. You could see him light up when he heard this. It's like he suddenly had a new perspective. His Holiness said, in every situation, we have to think about it from many different perspectives. So we don't just see it in a one-dimensional way, right? If we just see it as this person, didn't deserve this and this bad thing happened, that's one dimension. That doesn't mean it's not true, but we have to see 2 dimensions, 3 dimensions, 4 dimensions, 5, I think it's only said 6 dimensions. We have to understand that everything that happens is the result of many different causes and conditions. And sometimes something that even seems very terrible in other ways can be positive, or some other outcome that might have seemed to us to have been something, a much better outcome, would have had a much more detrimental effect in many other ways. It doesn't mean, again, it's hard to see how is it positive that such and such child died. It's definitely not positive for that child at that moment, but it's clearly what happened, and it's not something that's new in the world. One way we could see it, it's just one way to reflect on it, is when we hear about bad news, we might think, well, the world is just such a bad place. Why do these things keep happening? So one thing is to reflect on, well, okay, it did happen. Did it happen less this year than it did last year? Maybe it didn't, but it did happen less this year than 50 years ago. Maybe it did. Maybe at least there's some improvement. Doesn't mean that it's any better now than it was then. But it means that if we see there's some improvement, we have to say, well, why did it improve? Right? What is making this happen less than before? And can we increase those causes that it happens even less next time and try to do less of the things that are actually not effective? We can't just say everything is bad and there's no hope. We have to say, well, there is some hope because there are clearly some causes that are more effective than others. And if we can focus more on those causes, then we can decrease this happening so much in the future. Still, we might feel very sad about it. Whether we do it less in the future doesn't change what happened right now to this one person. So in that case, what else can we do? Again, we can reflect differently is one way. If we have some belief in karma, karma is not punitive. It's not saying this person deserved this thing. It's talking about cause and effect, right? There were causes that caused this. Just like, for example, this person died because, they ate the food that poisoned them. We didn't know that the particular food would have that kind of reaction for this person. That was a cause. It doesn't mean that person deserved it in any way, but if we could identify the cause, we could stop that from happening again. So likewise, the suffering the person experiences is the result of many different causes. And some of those, at least in Buddhist philosophy, are actions that have been done by someone with that particular mind stream in the past, out of delusion. It's not because the person did that thing and is now being punished. It's because they themselves failed to understand something. Nevertheless, this is part of a much more gradual process of evolution in the life, we say the life cycle, we could say, of that being. It's not that this person only lived for 1 year and then was blown away and then there's nothing more. Actually, this is part of a very, very long process of evolution for this being, of gradually trying to overcome delusion. And this was just one manifestation of it that we saw. This being, although they experience this terrible thing now, it's not the last chance. It's not the end of the hope for this person. And they, we don't, and then if we don't believe in reincarnation, that's harder. I mean, it's harder when we try to say, well, every individual person is just one life. And so we might have to step back and think about it. Well, first of all, why do we hold these views? If we want to think about it only in a one life system, that's okay. If that's what we feel comfortable accepting and what makes sense to us. But we have to think about, well, is it helpful to get depressed about this? Is it helping the situation? As Shantideva says, in his chapter on patience again, one of the first things he says in the chapter is that whatever I do, whatever happens, I'm not going to let it disturb my happiness of mind. Because my being happy is not going to help the situation. My being unhappy about it is not going to help the situation. It's only going to lead to me, creating less virtue in the future. Right? There is something I can do. The world has a lot of suffering. It could be a lot worse. And this could be happening to everybody all the time. And it's not happening to everybody all the time. So we have to think about what can we do in each individual situation. And then he goes on to say right after that, right, that if there's something that can be done about it, then what's the use of worrying about it, right? We should think, well, if there's something that can be done, I should do that. I should really be motivated to do that. If there's nothing that can be done about it, it doesn't help to feel bad about it, right? Sometimes we might think, well, if I don't feel bad, then it's somehow, that is unfair to that person. But actually, it's quite the opposite. If that person is, I would think if I was killed today, I wouldn't want the whole world to be mourning about me for the rest of eternity. That wouldn't really help me very much. if I knew that my dying today inspired others to try to prevent that from happening in the future to less and less people, I would feel at least there was some purpose in my having died. So we have to think about what's the best we can do with the situation as it is. And then within that, think about, again, cause and effect. We have to really think about what is the causes that are creating human suffering, or generally suffering in the world, not just humans. And what is the best we can do to try to eliminate those? Now, again, coming back to this point of altruism, of empathy, right? The 7 kinds of empathy. Essentially, what is identified as the most, you might say, the most mature or most adaptive reaction is compassion, right? They find that if somebody who has habitually cultivated compassion hears about somebody suffering, of course, they care, but it doesn't disturb their peace of mind. It actually increases what we would, objectively, if we're trying to measure somebody's brain, it would increase the happiness of their mind. So in any way that they're rejoicing in what happens, it's because it's enhancing their compassion, which compassion actually brings a sense of peace and joy to the mind. And so they did these tests with Mathieu Ricard, the French monk, and others who were in this test, but especially they used him as the example because he's one of the most skilled meditators that they've examined. And they would show him movies or slides of people being, experiencing great suffering, and then try to measure what happens in his reaction. And once they asked him, just don't react, try as much as you can, although you could be conditioned to meditating on compassion, to not do that. And then to do so when you meditate on compassion. And when he didn't meditate on compassion, they found it wore away at his energy. They could see his mind getting tired. And because he generally had a very strong mind, it wasn't that he just immediately became depressed, but it had a gradually incremental effect on his mind, as seeming to be less and less in a positive state. When they asked him to meditate on compassion, they showed him these same films or similar films. The effect was that they could see this sense of happiness and sort of, so you could say inner resolve. I don't know if they can measure that per se with looking at the brain, but they could see something was happening, that the mind was kind of firming itself to find a solution and to feel a sense of reaching out to these people. So although that doesn't immediately help the person, it certainly is helpful to us, right? And it's certainly not harming them. It's not helping them at all for us to feel any kind of depression about it. So those are just a number of suggestions. That was your first question. Your second question was about, just about karma. And I think I sort of addressed that. Again, it's not about retribution. It's just about understanding cause and effect. That sometimes that is leveled as a argument against karma, that it's just unfair. It's a very unfair way of looking at the universe, that these children who are killed, it's their fault. That's not the point. The point is that we have to look at cause and effect, and there's a whole progression of things going on here, right? So this one little piece of reality that we see, it's like periscopic vision. You look up and you just see this one little thing. You don't see the whole broad picture of what's going on in the grand scheme of things, of why this progression occurred. So that's essentially what karma is about, that there's a much deeper level of interdependence going on, of connection between past and future. And it shouldn't be seen as a kind of fatalism. It's not that somebody deserves this, or if they're born with this karma, they have no choice. It's just about being born with different potentials, that then somebody, they have the opportunity to overcome that, or it might be such a strong potential that they can't overcome it in this lifetime. But it doesn't mean that they never will. It doesn't mean that in some future lifetime, they won't have the opportunity to overcome that. So those are just some very brief responses. I mean, essentially the question you're asking is the heart of all religions, right? Most religions arose as a question: why do bad things happen to good people, and how do we think differently about it? So that is just a little bit about it. But I think His Holiness's fundamental answer is we have to think differently about it. We can't just think the way I'm feeling about it now is the only way that I could possibly react. There could be a different way to react, you know, through mental training. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
behalf of the entire Tushita family.
Mhm.
I know it was like 2 days and we covered so many topics, but but also I thank you and
Yeah.
I think everyone who were there. Thank you so much, Venerable. We would love to welcome you again in the
Okay.
future.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah. Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you for having me. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would
There's been
request.
demand actually.
What's that?
There's been a demand
From?
at least
Oh.
3 or 4 of us.
Okay.
We must hear him again.
Okay. Well, yeah.
Maybe like, remember,
Hmm.
in Root Institute, for Root Institute, it did the online course on the spelling dispute.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I did.
I think it could even be online.
Yeah, let's see. I should mention, and those of you who are interested, I mean, last year I started in our house, one of the monks asked that I would give Lamrim teachings. So I have been doing that weekly at the house, and that is posted online. So anyone who's interested, that should be starting again in a couple of weeks now. So that is on our Sera My House channel on YouTube. So that should hopefully be posted. And last year's is all available. And then this year, I'm also going to be giving courses or talks for the master's program in Italy. You know, there's the FPMT master's program, and they have studies. So they've asked that some of us at Sera who've studied these topics and debated them can give in-depth explanations. So for those of you who are in study programs, that would be interesting. And even those of you who are not, it'll be a bit more technical. You know, the first talk is going to be about bodhicitta. So like these things I've been talking about, expanded mind. A lot of these are quite technical terms, but it might be interesting to all of you because yesterday and today, I mean, a lot of what I was talking about was not Buddhist philosophy. So in a lot of ways, I'm stretching my field of expertise, but when we do the talks on Buddhist philosophy, it'll be the actual what I've been trained in. So I'll have a little bit more confidence of what I'm saying. And then in general, yeah, we'll just have to see. As I said, in the next few years, it's likely I'll be passing to Delhi again, so I'll try my best to come here when I can. In terms of online courses, it's going to be hard to do what I did those 2 years. I mean, that was during COVID, and so I had more free time, more ability to manage that kind of thing. Whereas now, you know, I'm getting more young students in the monastery, especially my young teenage boy that I'm taking care of. So that takes a lot of time, and I'm also the director of the house now there. So it's just very, very difficult to get a lot of extra time. We'll have to see though, and I want to do as best as I can. So you know, we'll see. And of course, if you know people make requests, it's more likely it'll come to mind again to think maybe to try to do something. So if you're really interested, you could ask again or think about what's possible in the future. We'll just have to see. So thank you. Yeah.
One last thing, I think I know there are few people, but we'll still have a group photograph. with you.
Okay. Yeah. All right.
Please stop here.
All right. All right. Come here, or I should
No,
come
you
up?
can- you
Okay.
sit here.
Sit here. Okay.
Let's stop the recording.
Okay.